So, can you talk about the foreign policy that you charted with President Lula in two ways? I mean, one, how does it seemed like from reading about it, and obviously you correct me if I'm wrong, but that it was a seamless connection, that the incredible efforts and achievements against poverty and inequality in Brazil were connected to how Brazil saw itself in the world in terms of its relationships from from West Africa to the United States, from the Caribbean to Israel, Palestine, and that, and this, I don't know if this is the right word, but that there was an idea maybe of a non-aligned foreign policy, not trying to have conflicts or bad relations with anyone, but positive, constructive relationships with all, built on Brazil's historical connections.
Well, I think you're right when you say there is this kind of. Let me just make a parenthesis here because I have a book which was published in the United States by Rowland and Littleton, which is precisely about the assertiveness of Brazilian foreign policy during the Lula period, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that with Lula coming to power, in a way, it was an anticipation of the slogan or the motto of Obama's. I mean, yes, we can. I mean, yes, we can have someone who was a worker, a metal worker, a very, very poor origin, become president, being faithful to his origins and still be able to conduct foreign policy in a very assertive way. And as you said, I mean, Brazil did what it did at the time, involved in very complex questions from WTO to the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, and became involved also in Palestine and all that, and integration of South America. We doubled the number of our embassies in Africa. But all that had to do with that assertiveness that to some extent had to do with the coming to power to Lula and to the fact that when Lula came to power, the biggest flaw of Brazilian society, which was inequality, is inequality, which, as I said, comes back from slavery, but went on and on and on. The biggest flaw was for the first time attacked seriously. Seriously. I mean, the Bolsa Familia, the stipendium that's given to families, the quotas, the programs for housing. I mean, all these things, the family agriculture, mind you, it's many programs. So that gave us a kind of self-confidence that we didn't have before. And of course, Brazil is a big country. We have borders with 10 countries. We have diversified relations in any case, contrary to other countries because of geography or whatever, or history. So all that gave confidence and allowed us to conduct, to lead this kind of foreign policy, which was actually well received. And I tell you, it's not that Brazil tried to be there present. Brazil was called. I mean, I remember, for instance, an Egyptian foreign minister calling me and say, please, Celso, ask Lula to call Shimon Peres because the situation here in Gaza, or it was East Jerusalem, I'm not sure now what it was, the situation, is untenable and Lula can influence. Don't underestimate the influence of Brazil. So Brazil had apparently this characteristic of soft power that in spite of the problems that we still had, but we were tackling them. So we had tackled in the past the problem of democracy, the problem of the absence of democracy. We were tackled in the past in different governments, the problem of the economic instability. And now with Lula, we were tackling the biggest problem, in my opinion, which is social inequality. So all that, apart from the size of the country, the demographics, the economic, Brazil is one of the 10 biggest economies. At some point was the sixth or seventh. Never very sure because this depends on exchange rates and so on. But anyway, so all these things put together, plus a strong diplomacy, which is being destroyed now by this, well, destroyed or at least maimed now by this kind of action that you mentioned in the beginning, all that gave Brazil a voice in world affairs. And, I'm not speaking things abstractly. I mean, I'm saying, for instance, we had the group in relation to the reform of the Security Council, which united Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. So the so-called aspiring countries to become permanent members in whatever format. I mean, that's not. Don't want to go into that. But I remember the German foreign minister uh, asking me to say, please, also talk to the Africans because they listen to you. They don't listen to me so much. He was saying that. So that's the mixture of these national characteristics which are now being undermined. I mean, they were not so solid as we thought. Unfortunately, that's I have to admit that because even during the military regime in Brazil, the military dictatorship, it was seen as something somehow strange to the country. It was not. It might have some popularity at some point when was strong economic growth, but the kind of hatred that you see now, the kind of massive attack on culture, on education, on foreign policy, because foreign policy, of course, necessarily has an ideological dimension. Ideological, not in the sense only of being right or left, but in the sense of solidarity
Right.
or self-assertiveness or whatever. All these things are being attacked in a way that were never before, not in the same scale. So on the same scale. So that's again make us think that maybe many of the characteristics of the Brazilian people, which we thought were positive, like the tolerance and solidarity and so on, were not so solid as we thought.
Do you
They can
see?
no, these are states of mind. So
Yeah.
maybe with proper leadership and proper conditions, they may rise again.
Do you see specifically? Because I would like maybe you could speak to both things. Because I would like you to speak to Lula as a political prisoner, but maybe even more broadly, do you? We spoke with Valeska Martins on the show several months ago.
Yeah.
We do a lot of coverage of foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world. It's a large role. How do we navigate solidarity as we kind of, as we sit in Brooklyn and think through these things? Do you think there was a U.S. role in the lawfare and political process against Lula and the Workers' Party? And if so, where would that was that just because of the basic claims of sovereignty over Brazil of the Lula government?
Well, I think, I don't want to make like one of the prosecutors here that he said, I don't have the evidence, but I have the conviction. So I don't want to say the same thing about
Right.
Lula. But
Thank you.
that's a judicial process. It's different from politics. On politics, you can make inferences.
Right.
Yeah. And what I would say is that by the logic of things, I have the impression that yes, there was, and by also the evidence, the scant evidence that we might have, but it's some evidence anyway of cooperation between the car wash operation and the attorneys in the United States and the DOJ in the United States. I think it very probably, yes, there was a role for the United States. How much it was a planned role, how much it was instigating in the beginning by the United States, or it was the other way around. It started when I say the United States, it's not necessarily the United States government. It was not necessarily Obama. Actually, mind you, when Snowden made those revelations about spying in Brazil, Germany, and other countries, well, Obama gave the impression that he didn't know. I'm not sure that he knew or he didn't. But anyway, so there are things, I mean, which come from the intelligence community, which come from other places, or which come from the interest of financial capital, in which not the government is not necessarily involved. But if you read some declarations, for instance, from the former ambassador in Brazil and was former undersecretary or even deputy secretary, undersecretary, I think, in the United States, Tom Shannon, you'll see that he says more or less that and I think this was in an interview. I don't remember. I don't know if it was Forbes or anything like that, in the United States. Tom Shannon saying that we followed with great attention, concern. I don't know what was the precise word. What Brazil was trying to do in terms of integration of South America, forming a bloc with more participation in world affairs. And now it's not him saying, but I'm saying. And at the same time, you had things like the BRICS, which somehow had an impact on the world balance or whatever. So I would not be surprised. And you had the oil and the findings of the oil in the deep sea in Brazil, and the decision to take the oil for us. So, I mean, if you take all these things together, I would not be surprised that something, I don't know if there is a deep state as such in terms of an entity, but that these interests together could well have, I'm certain, more or less certain, that these have helped the lawfare that took place in Brazil. And not only the lawfare, also the political implications in Congress and otherwise, I mean, with the impeachment of Dilma and all that. I mean, I'm pretty convinced of that. But, I don't have evidence for everything, but I think it's the natural thing. And, everything that we have seen from communications that were in the WikiLeaks to other things that even were said publicly. I mean, in the case of the legal cooperation, there was an attorney of the United States who said very clearly that he praised the kind of informal cooperation. What is informal cooperation? I mean, it's the cooperation without the knowledge of the governments. So, and that's what, and if you take the national security document in the United States, it puts fight against corruption as a number one thing. It used to be fight against terrorism, and now it's corruption. Okay. It's okay to fight terrorism, it's okay to fight corruption, but it can also be used to regime change, as it has been used in many places.
Well, that's actually, and I hope, I should just say, I really hope that we can host you again, if that's possible, because there's so many other things I'd like to ask you about, but I know we don't have so much time left. But before we get to my more sort of closing question, that's a big concern to me, this discourse of corruption, both in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and yes, okay, it maybe has exposed, the former Malaysian prime minister, as an example, really was, implicated in this sort of massive hedge fund sort of theft and so on. It's not to deny that corruption.
Speaking of Lula, I mean, Lula even if the accusations are right, were right, which they are not. But if they were right, it's the reform of a toilet in a very poor farm in the interior of Sao Paulo, and things like that.
So the charges against Lula are shocking. Anytime an American, particularly Americans who are lawyers, I will say, who have no interest and no investment in this, if they hear the basics of the case and they say, "Hey man, if you're telling me everything, that's crazy. How did that even make it to trial?" But the corruption rhetoric is a tool of U.S. foreign policy. And then there's also the fact that all of these right-wing governments that we've been talking about earlier, Donald Trump talked about drain the swamp. Bolsonaro said he'd get rid of corruption. In Poland, they have brought forward anti-corruption legislation. In India, Modi was quite connected to anti-corruption drives. So you have, in the case of someone like Lula, that absolutely the charges, from everything I can see, are totally false and wrong. But there's also a broader problem with usually politicians, by the way, that are very corrupt themselves, using a language of corruption that makes it about morality, not about the system itself. Of course, Washington is corrupt. It's run by special interest money. Of course, there's corruption in political systems, but it becomes about personal morality of usually left-wing leaders or center-left leaders that can be demonized. And then these right-wing politicians are able to use this very simplified rhetoric.
Yes, let me say one thing. Of course, it's part of the U.S. foreign policy, but it's very much part also of the thinking of the elite in Brazil. Of course, the bankers who get millions and millions and millions of reais or U.S. dollars or whatever, they are financing the newspapers and the media in general, like the TV, like TV Globo, for instance, and they are using this rhetoric also. I mean, it's not something totally important. It's also important, but it's also part of the ideology of the ruling classes. When they can't find any other reason or any other argument that will be convincing for the people, corruption is a very strong thing. In Brazil, it's not the first time. I mean, with the I mean, of course, for the times are differ, so it's difficult to compare exactly. But when we had Vargas in the Vargas in the 50s were elected democratically, but he ran policies for the workers and also took decisions on sovereignty, as you say, in the question of the oil company Petrobras, creating a national bank for development and so on. The same thing happened. He was accused of corruption very strongly. There was almost a coup d'etat. He committed suicide. He died, and nothing was discovered later. It was abandoned because the objective was there, or was obtained, which was to. So it's a very powerful weapon and very, on the other hand, very abstract. So it's easy. It's something that you can tell almost of anybody. Because what is corruption? Was it one specific bribe about one person? Is it tolerating a bribe somewhere else? Was not even. What is it? I don't know. When you listen to some of the attorneys in Brazil, prosecutors, whatever, the attorneys, they seem to say that Lula was the head of a big, was the couple of the whole thing. And so he must have known. On the other hand, the accusations against him are not the formal accusations by which he was condemned. Don't deal with that because they know that they couldn't prove that. So they use one thing politically and look for a very, very absurd thing. And would it be right to be minor to accuse him?
Right.
With the absurd conclusion that Lula is the head of a criminal organization in which all other members got much more than he. What kind of this is hard even to conceive of, you know. So it's very clear that the objective was to topple Dilma, to prevent Lula from running, because they don't want a progressive government in Brazil. And the progressive in Brazil has two dimensions, I would say. One is, let us say, towards internally to diminish inequality, and there is an external one, which is to have an independent foreign policy based on solidarity with other developing countries, and having good relations with the United States. I mean, Lula and Bush went very well, actually. And I went very well with Colin Powell, Condi Rice. Of course, we had different points of view on some questions, but very cordially, very friendly. So one thing didn't prevent the other. But even so, the independence after the crisis of you have also to see the crisis of 2008. So the financial capital is needing more markets to be more sure about the markets. So there is a combination of things. There are geostrategic things, which also have a big weight, of course. I mean, everybody is preoccupied with democracy in Venezuela, which, okay, I'm also preoccupied with democracy in Venezuela, but no one worries with democracy in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
No?
I think yes, the worry about Saudi Arabia from the Trump administration is quite different, to say the least. Maybe there's an opportunity for some very special forms of foreign direct investment from Saudi.
I don't have the evidence.
No, we have no evidence. We have no evidence of this. We know, but certainly there's not a concern for democracy. So, as a final question, I would like to ask you two things. One that's more just sort of personal. Do you see and visit President Lula? What is your sense of, especially in light of, we interviewed Glenn Greenwald, of course, with all of these revelations, and we've regularly followed the work of Brian Mayer and Brazil Wire, which is how we come to you. Mm-hmm. And then more broadly, if you're speaking to an audience that is everywhere, but mostly in the United States, what is the significance of freeing Lula as a political prisoner, obviously first and foremost for Brazil, but also in a way that is connected to the broader struggle against the kind of global far right that we were talking about in the beginning?
Well, I think the liberation of Lula would have a global impact. Lula is, of course, as you said, is a reformist, a progressive, but he's a man of dialogue. He's a man, no one was put in prison. No capitalist can complain of not being received by Lula, or at least his representatives, or his or her representatives. So I think, and what Brazil needs more than anything else now is dialogue, peaceful dialogue between different, and the recovery of the, let us say, the rational discourse, because now it's irrationality. It's typical of the far right, the irrationality to play the far right. This is not new in the history of mankind. Humankind, we had that in the 30s, as I mentioned before. Actually, by the way, you mentioned corruption being used. And the other day I was reading an article in the FT, and the illustration, I don't know if it was in the paper, but I mean, that's what I saw on the internet. The illustration was a poster from 35 or 36 in Germany. It's a big army, and it's an official poster, from what I could guess. It was with an arm of a person, which is creating fight corruption, and written fight corruption, and the hand was smashing Jews and communists. So that's how it is used.
Right. And do you see President Lula? Oh, sorry.
Not only for Brazil, but I think it is important for all developing countries, and to a large extent even to the balance of the world, because not Brazil will be decisive. I don't have any. But if you have Brazil going in a more democratic way, if India was going also in a more democratic way, and if we have a dialogue with different countries of different ideologies and so on, this helps the world to find. And this was, it's not only me. I was foreign minister for Lula, so it's natural that I try to defend his legacy. But I heard that, and actually I promoted a seminar based on what I heard from Dominique de Villepin, who was foreign minister for a center-right government in France by Chirac. And he said, we need Brazil for the world balance, more than ever. I mean, he was speaking about Trump and this right-wing movement. But it must be a democratic Brazil. And that's really what we don't have now. We are running fast to a very I'm very much concerned. I don't want to use words because, it's very easy to speak about fascism or whatever. And each ideology has its time. But we are going to very extreme situations, the denial of rationality, the denial of science, which affects environment, affects human rights, affects whatever you want. And all that is very worrying. And it's not new in the world. It's new in Brazil.
And do you see President Lula from time to time, and how is he?
Well, he hasn't. I've seen him 5 times after he has been in prison. He can receive 2 visitors a week. Apart from family, who also once a week, and apart from the lawyers. So I went there 5 times, always with someone else. Sometimes Brazilian. In 2 cases was some foreign visiting us. The last one, the latest one was the candidate of the Cristina Kirchner and the Justicialist party in Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, who actually also was the person who introduced me to the Pope. The Pope also has been speaking indirectly, but he has been speaking about lawfare, actually about lawfare directly, but indirectly about the Lula situation. Lula has a very high spirit. It's very puzzling even for you to see someone who has been, because it's jail after all. It's not luxury at all, but it's maybe correct for someone to say it's not, but it doesn't have a sight outside. It has, it's the window. There's a window for light comes in, but he cannot see outside. So it's a jail in a way. And his spirit is always thinking and analyzing the situation in Brazil, proposing solutions. He reads a lot, so he's prepared. It's very sometimes you have to be prepared to be in prison. He's prepared to be put out of prison.
Right. Well, Celso Amorim, we really, really appreciate your time. I missed that?
No, in the case of Lula, indignation, yes, but no depression or whatever.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your time. Celso Amorim served as a foreign minister in the Lula da Silva government, defense minister for Dilma Rousseff. He was also an ambassador to many countries besides that, lifelong diplomat, strategist. I hope you can join us again sometime, and we really appreciate it.
I'm also an author of a book published in the U.S.
Tell me the name of the book again, please, because
Well, the book is called, it's precisely about one of your questions, so that's why I mentioned it. It's
Please.
Act Globally, Memoirs of Brazil's Assertive Foreign Policy, and it is published by Roman and Middleton.
We'll have all of the information to the book as well and all of the show descriptions, and people will find it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, and I just ordered that book, of course. Celso Amorim. It was a real honor to have him on. And great debut of Brooke Thomas. Matt coming in heavy to get a magic mushroom story out of me on the main show. Which I guess is for some people who go like, I love the show, but I want more comedy in the main part.
I was just trying to make the guest feel more comfortable by helping you two relate.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.